sold for the $60 to the old man.
$60, the old man said, and the whole tent laughed at him. The auctioneer didn't even look up the first time. A welded-shut ammo can, rust eating the corners, a lid that hadn't moved in half a century, that wasn't a lot, that was scrap. Man in the third row hollered that he'd pay 60 cents to haul it off. Somebody else said the old fella probably thought there was gold inside, and the laughter rolled through the folding chairs the way it always does when a crowd decides a man is a fool. But the old man just raised his paddle again, steady as a fence post, and said it one more time. $60. Nobody bids against a joke. So the joke was his, and he carried it out under his arm while the room was still grinning. An 80-pound block of rusted steel that not one person in that tent believed could ever be opened. His name was Earl Coyle. He was 78 years old, and he had not said one word to defend himself, because Earl had learned a long time ago that some things you don't explain to a room, you explain them to the night, alone, with a hacksaw. If you've ever watched a good man get laughed at, and known the crowd had it exactly backwards type, howna in the comments right now, because by the end of this you're going to understand why he never opened his mouth. Earl had buried his wife 2 springs back, and since then his days had gotten quiet in the way an old house gets quiet, when only one set of footsteps still crosses the floor. He kept busy the way men of his generation keep busy. He fixed what was broken, and he didn't throw away what could still be saved. Saturdays he went to the surplus auctions out past the county fairgrounds. Not because he needed anything, but because there was something in him that couldn't stand to see Marine Corps green sold off by the pound to people who didn't know what they were holding. He'd been a Marine once. Most folks in town didn't know that. He didn't wear it on a hat or a bumper sticker. He'd done a tour in 1969, and he'd come home and gone to work at the rail yard for 31 years, and the war was a door inside him that he kept shut, the same way that ammo can was welded shut, for reasons that were nobody's business but his own. He almost didn't bid. That morning, he'd been about to leave. And then the auctioneer's boy set that rusted can up on the table, and Earl saw the stencil on the side, faded, half scoured off by 50 years of rust and rain, but he saw it. A unit marking, old style, and below it, scratched into the paint by hand, the way a man scratches his name into something he intends to come back for, 2 letters. DM. Earl's stomach dropped through the floor of him, and he raised his paddle before his brain had finished telling his arm to do it. He didn't know yet. He just had a feeling, the kind of feeling that takes hold low in the gut and doesn't let go. $60, sold to the old man they were laughing at. He drove home with the can-riding shotgun where Margaret used to sit. He set it on his workbench under the bare bulb in the garage, and he stood there looking at it for a long while before he picked up a tool. He ran his thumb over those 2 scratched letters, DM. He told himself it didn't mean anything. Half the gear that ever came out of a supply tent had somebody's initials scratched into it. It didn't have to mean what the cold feeling in his chest was telling him it meant, but his hands were already moving. The lid had been welded down on all 4 sides. Somebody had run a bead clean around the seam, deliberate, careful, the work of a man who wanted whatever was in there to stay dry and stay safe and stay closed until the right person opened it. An angle grinder would have torn through it in 2 minutes. But Earl didn't reach for the grinder, he reached for the hacksaw. Because if this was what the feeling said it was, then it deserved patience. It deserved a man's own hands and a man's own time, so he sawed. For the better part of an hour, he sawed through that old weld in the yellow light, the blade singing, sweat coming up on his forehead, his shoulder aching the way 78-year-old shoulders ache, until the last of the bead gave way and the lid groaned and lifted on a hinge that hadn't moved since before half the men who'd laughed at him were born. Inside, the smell came up first. Old oil, old cloth, the particular mustiness of something that has been sealed away from air for a very long time, and then he saw it. Wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age was a bundle, and Earl lifted it out with 2 hands the way you lift something that might come apart, and he laid it on the bench and folded back the cloth. A pistol. A Colt 1911. The old .45 automatic. The Marine sidearm. The steel gone grey, but the lines of it unmistakable. Beneath it, a folded sheet of paper, soft as fabric at the creases. And beneath that, a set of dog tags on a chain, and a second document, heavier stock, official form, with a typed heading he had to tilt toward the light to read. He read the dog tags first. He always would, after he'd tell people that the rest of the world stopped existing. The second he read those tags, because the name stamped into that little oval of steel was a name Earl Coyle had not said out loud in 57 years. A name he had last heard spoken not by a friend, not by a brother, but by a first sergeant standing in a clearing in the Quezon Mountains in the spring of 1969, calling the roll after the worst day of Earl's life. A name that had been called out 3 times into the silence, the way the Corps calls the name of a man who is gone, and got no answer, 3 times, while Earl stood in formation with his jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth would break. Mercer, Daniel J. Danny Mercer, the kid, the gunner, the 19-year-old who had been carrying the M60 the day the whole world came apart on that ridge, and who had not come down off it. Earl put his hand flat on the workbench to keep from going down. 57 years. He had carried Danny Mercer for 57 years, and now Danny Mercer's pistol and Danny Mercer's tags were lying on his garage workbench under a 40-watt bulb, $60, and a hacksaw, and a half a century away from a ridgeline on the other side of the earth. He unfolded the soft sheet of paper, with hands that would not stop shaking. It was a citation, a recommendation typed on a field typewriter, the kind a company clerk hammered out on a board across his knees. It described an action on a ridge designated Hill 425 during Operation Oklahoma Hills. The spring offensive, the 7th of March Inez, had run through the Quezon Mountains west of Anhoa in 1969. It described a machine gunner, Lance Corporal Daniel J. Mercer, who, when his rifle squad was caught in the open by interlocking fire and the order came to fall back, had not fallen back. It described how he had set his gun on the exposed crest and held it there alone, firing into the tree line so that the men behind him could drag their wounded down off the ridge and into the draw. Quote, it described how he had kept that gun running long after any sane man would have left it, how he had bought the minutes with his own life, and how, when the platoon finally fought its way back up that slope at dusk, they had found him still behind the gun. The recommendation was for the Navy Cross, the second highest award this nation can give a Marine. And it had never been awarded. Earl knew that for a fact, knew it in his bones, because he had spent 57 years believing that Danny Mercer had died for nothing and been remembered by no one but him. The paperwork had been written, and the paperwork had been welded into an ammo can and lost to the world. If you have ever carried the weight of someone the rest of the world managed to forget, type STD in the comments, because that word is about to mean more than you know. Earl did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with Danny's tags in his fist and the citation flat in front of him. And somewhere around 3 in the morning he made a decision. He was not going to let this go back into a drawer. He was going to find out who Danny Mercer had left behind, and he was going to get that boy the medal the Corps had promised him and lost. It took Earl most of a week of phone calls to the Marine Corps, to a casualty office that bounced him to a record centre, to a man at the 1st of March In-Division Association who took down everything Earl said in a voice that got quieter and quieter the longer Earl talked. Earl gave him the names, the dates, the hill number, the serial number stamped into the frame of that old .45, and there was a long silence on the line. And then the man said, in a careful voice, that he needed to make a call, and that someone was going to want to speak with Earl directly, and that Earl should not, under any circumstances, let that pistol out of his sight. 3 days later, a car Earl didn't recognize pulled into his driveway, and a man got out of it, and Earl knew before the man reached the porch that this was somebody you can tell, not by the suit, though the suit was good. By the way he carried himself, the way he came up the walk, with his shoulders square and his eyes already wet. He was maybe 70 years old, tall, white-haired, and he stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at Earl for a long moment before he could speak. "Corporal Coyle," he said, "not Mr. Corporal. My name is Samuel Riddick. I don't expect you'd remember me. The last time you saw me, I was a 19-year-old PFC, bleeding into the dirt, halfway down the backside of Hill 425, and you were the man dragging me by the straps of my flak jacket." Earl's legs went out from under him, and he sat down hard on the top step, because he did remember. Of course, he remembered Sammy, the radioman, the skinny kid from Ohio who'd taken 2 rounds through the thigh and would have died on that ridge if somebody hadn't gotten him down. Earl had always assumed somebody else had done it. He'd been so deep in the fog of that day he'd never been sure of anything except that Danny was gone, and it was his fault, because Earl had been the team's gunner before. Danny was Earl had handed off the M60 to the kid 3 weeks earlier, when Earl made corporal, and Earl had spent 57 years certain that if he kept the gun, it would have been him on that crest, not a 19-year-old boy. And now this man, this stranger, who was not a stranger, was standing in his driveway, and he had become a lieutenant general of the United States Marine Corps, 3 stars, a career that had started on the day a corporal named Earl Coyle decided not to leave him behind. "I have spent 40 years, General Riddick said, and his voice broke, and he let it break, trying to find out what happened to Danny Mercer's effects. His mother died in 1991, still waiting for someone to tell her what her son did. There was no one left to push the citation. The gunny who wrote it up was killed 11 days later a good night, and everything he was carrying went into a Connex. The Connex went into a surplus lot, and the trail went cold. I had given up." He looked at the rusted can on Earl's porch, the can a whole auction tent had laughed at. "And a corporal I last saw in 1969 found it for $60 and cut it open with a hacksaw." Then the general told Earl the one thing Earl had needed to hear for 57 years and never knew to ask for, that Danny Mercer had not stayed on that gun because anybody made him. That Danny had looked at Earl, who was already hit, already dragging Riddick, and had told him to go, to get the wounded down, that he'd cover. That it had been Danny's choice and Danny's alone, and that Earl handing off that gun 3 weeks earlier hadn't sent a boy to die. It had put the right Marine in the right place to save 11 men. "You didn't fail him, Corporal," Riddick said. "You're the reason any of us came home to fail him later. Now let's go finish what that boy earned." It took the better part of a year, and it took a United States Senator, and a review board, and the patient testimony of an old corporal and a 3-star general. But on a clear morning, the following spring, they stood in a quiet ceremony with a folded flag and a shadow box, and the Navy Cross that Lance Corporal Daniel J. Mercer had earned in 1969, and waited 57 years to receive. Danny's last living relative, a great-niece, who had grown up hearing only that there had been a great-uncle who didn't come home, accepted the medal with her hand over her mouth, and the auctioneer was there. Cody, the young man who'd run the sale, who'd laughed along with the rest of that tent, he'd read about it in the paper, and he'd driven 200 miles, and he stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and afterward he found Earl and could barely get the words out. He'd given his whole commission back. He'd asked, would Earl let him build a proper display, a place at the auction house where Danny's story could be told, so that the next time some old man bought something nobody else understood, somebody might think twice before they laughed. Earl told him yes. Earl told him that was a fine thing for a young man to want to do, because the antagonist of this story was never cruel. He was just young, and young men laugh at what they haven't learned to see yet, and the whole point of an old man's silence is to give them the chance to learn. Earl keeps the ammo can on a shelf in his garage now, scrubbed of its rust, the lid he sawed open, propped up on its old hinge, empty. The pistol and the tags and the citation are in a shadow box at the Division Museum, where men who understand will see them. But Earl kept the can, because to everyone in that tent it had been a welded box that couldn't be opened, a fool's $60, a doorstop. And to Earl, it had been a boy. It had been a 19-year-old machine gunner holding a ridge alone so 11 men could see their children, holding it past all reason, holding it steady until the end. They called Danny Mercer's name 3 times in 1969 and got nothing back but silence. It took 57 years and an old man who wouldn't explain himself to a laughing room, but that name finally got the answer it earned. If you believe that no Marine should ever have to wait 57 years to be remembered, that the quiet ones carry the heaviest things, and that what's welded shut and laughed at might just be a life waiting for the right man to open it, then type Hanor one more time, hit subscribe, and share this with a veteran who knows that the loudest men in the room are almost never the ones holding the gun. Because the next time you're standing at an auction and somebody pays good money for a box nobody else can open, you don't laugh, you watch, you wait. And you remember Danny Mercer. Semper Fi.